Hi guys, so a while ago I did a top 10 for train related movies. Today I'm doing the exact same thing for planes. I'd like to do one of these for all vehicles eventually, even some of the really obscure ones like Jeeps and hovercrafts, although I'd have to find 9 more movies that actually have hovercrafts other than Diamonds Are Forever. In terms of planes, I do have some honourable mentions today, films which didn't quite make it in. So first of all, Turbulence, which I believe was a 90s thriller starring Ray Liotta. I just barely remember it. I think it was a film that me and my dad rented, but I've not given it a minute's thought in almost 30 years. I can't remember much about it. Next up, Top Gun, a really cheesy 80s film with Tom Cruise in it. I'm not really into all that dogfighting stuff though, to be honest, and so this film doesn't make it in. I've heard that the second film, Top Gun Maverick, is a lot better, but I've not gotten around to seeing that yet. And my final honourable mention, well actually it's a pair of honourable mentions, Planes and Planes 2 Fire and Rescue, those animated films that Pixar did. Now, I don't usually watch films like this, but I've got a lot of nostalgia for the times when my kids were young enough that I would get roped into watching such films, and I kind of liked Planes 1 and 2. Out of those two subsets of films, Cars and Planes, I always thought that Planes was better, I've got to say. But that's the end of my honourable mentions. Let's dive into the main list, and we will start with the film that I consider to be the 10th best plane-related movie of all time. So at number 10 we have Firefox, a Cold War thriller from the early 80s starring Clint Eastwood. This is sort of a film of two halves, though I think the first half is a lot longer than the second half, though, from memory. So in that first half, we've got Eastwood trying to infiltrate Russia. There's lots of spycraft going on. Second half, Eastwood grabs a jet and tries to hot-tail it back to America with all these Russian MiGs on his tail, and there's lots of dogfighting. Funnily enough, the stuff with the planes in this movie is actually my least favourite part of it. I kind of wish that this whole film had just been the spy element and we hadn't really had the plane battles. But it's reasonably good. It's not one of Eastwood's best, I'd say, but if you like Top Gun and you like spy films, then you'll probably like this even more than I did. I'm probably going to be rewatching this film quite soon, actually, because I'm currently doing a run through Clint Eastwood's films, and I've just got done watching The Enforcer from '76, so I'm guessing that Firefox can't be too far away, actually. So at number 9 we have Snakes on a Plane. I saw this at the cinema with my dad and my brother. We weren't kids. This was 2006, so I would have been getting on 26. I guess my brother would have been about 22. It was a reunion type thing at the time, and we had this cinema trip, but my dad, ever the joker, once we got into the screening, he sat in the middle of me and my brother, and he decided to turn his arms into snakes. So throughout the film, he would occasionally just do this. He would kind of go tss and reach down and tickle us both at the same time, which got a little bit irritating after a while, but it's just the way he was. He liked to do silly things like that, you know. As for the film, I thought this was a little bit disappointing, actually. And if you're wondering why I've therefore included it in my list, it's simply the fact that I don't have that many plane-related films that I can call upon for today's ranking. But yeah, I expected better than this, I've got to say. It's a film that ends just when it's getting going. Like, you've got all these snakes of different sizes all over this plane, and people panicking and people dying. And then suddenly all the snakes get flushed out of the window and, hey, we're done. You know, I was like, oh, okay, that's that then. Fine. I mean, there are a couple of good kills. There's a couple who get killed in a toilet, and there's one guy who gets swallowed whole by the biggest snake on the plane, from what I can recall. And there's a very funny gag where everyone on the plane thinks that this one guy is gay just because of his camp voice, and then it turns out he's actually straight and he's got this really hot girlfriend. But on the whole, wasn't massively impressed by it. I've never gone back to it since 2006, and I probably won't again. At number 8, we have Executive Decision. Similar to Turbulence that I mentioned earlier, this was a thriller from the 90s. It stars Kurt Russell, I think, and Steven Seagal, so there's some real star power in there. Now, I think Russell and Seagal have to work together because a terrorist or two has taken over like a commercial airliner, and these two have got to try and get onto the plane and stop the terrorists. Now, there's a big twist about half an hour into this movie which absolutely stunned me and my dad when we watched this film. Like, honestly, we had this on a VHS rental and we literally rewound the tape 1 minute just to check that we had definitely witnessed what we had just witnessed. You'll understand if you've seen the film. It does take you back when you first see it. I can't remember that much about what happens later on in this film. I think from memory, Russell just gradually gets on top of the terrorist and sorts the whole situation out. But I haven't actually seen the film since the 90s. I just remember it being a lot better than Turbulence. Hence why I'm putting it, this high in my top 10 today. But it's worth checking out if you can find it on streaming somewhere. At number 7, we have Con Air, another 90s thriller. It's like the 1990s was the era of the aeroplane movie, and I just didn't realise it until today. This film was regarded as being really cool at the time that it came out. Like, I was at high school when this got released, and from time to time this would get talked about in the playground, and if you liked Con Air, then you were very much on the side of coolness, I mean, you've got Nicolas Cage with his long hair and his way of speaking, put the bunny back in the box. He's like some dude from the local factory. He's a relatable, normal guy, but he's tough and he's going to take down the villains, and Nicolas Cage himself was really cool in the 90s. And then you've got the villains who've all got these cool names like Cue Ball and Cyrus the Virus, and they're really cool as well. So the whole film just reeks of cool. And yet, it's technically an action film. That's how you describe it. But the action in it is not that great, really. I can't think of one decent action part in this, really. I mean, it's entertaining. The dialogue's fun. The characters are great. And once it's on, you can't stop watching it. It's one of those. But as an action film, I don't think it quite hits the notes of some of the other great action films from the 90s. So for me, it's more a piece of nostalgia from back in the day rather than some really hot film that I keep going back to, because I honestly don't. I've seen it like 3 or 4 times maybe in the past, but I think the last of those was quite some time ago now. At number 6, Air Force One, a 90s film. So this is sort of like Die Hard on a plane, I guess. I think most people will know that Air Force One is the name of the plane that the President of the United States flies around on. And in this film, some Russian terrorists somehow get on board, they take over the plane, and it's up to the president himself, played by Harrison Ford in this instance, to escape the clutches of the terrorists and go around picking them off one by one. I sort of feel like they didn't need to create a new character for Harrison Ford in this film. They could have just had him play Jack Ryan, because in the early 90s, Harrison Ford did these 2 thrillers called Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger, where he was playing the same character in both, Jack Ryan. Now, in the Jack Ryan novels by Tom Clancy, I think Jack Ryan goes on to become the president in those stories. So I think they could have made this the 3rd Jack Ryan film, really, although obviously it wouldn't have then corresponded to any of the actual Clancy novels, but I don't know, just something that occurred to me. But this is a really good thriller. Certainly the star power of Ford and Gary Oldman, who plays the main bad guy. They keep this film chugging along. Not as cool a film as Con Air, but better. At number 5, we have The Langoliers. I can't remember which decade this came out in, actually. I think it might have been the 90s, now that I think about it, though. So this is based upon a Stephen King novella. So we've got this like commercial airline that accidentally flies through a black hole and into a world which looks just like our own, except there's no people in it, and there's all these flying meatballs with teeth that try and kill our main protagonists. It's better than it sounds, believe me. It's got a little bit of a TV movie feel to it. In fact, that's probably what it was when it came out, now that I think about it. But it's good. It's a good little thriller. It's a very good story, very good sci-fi tale, and I absolutely recommend it. It's a Liam Neeson thriller. He plays a kind of airport security guard who suspects that there might be a bomb on a commercial airplane, and so throughout the flight he's going up and down the aisle trying to solve the mystery, and it turns out some of the passengers are not who they say they are, kind of a thing. I can't remember how this film pans out, but it's very exciting. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a little bit similar to Executive Decision, which we had earlier on in the rankings, although I think this is the superior film, albeit there will be some recency bias there, definitely. At number 3, we have Quarantine 2 Terminal, the first and only horror film in today's ranking, which is kind of weird given that I am such a horror guy, but aeroplanes and horror films don't usually mix that often, probably because the horror genre is quite low budgeted and simulating air travel in movies is quite expensive, I presume. I'm just guessing, but you don't usually see that many horror films on planes, usually. But Quarantine 2 gave it a go. There was one other horror film I did almost include for this, actually. One of the earlier Resident Evil animated films, I forget what it was called, but the first act of that was entirely in an airport with loads of zombie action, but no actual scenes on a plane, so I decided to not include it. Quarantine 2 does spend some time on a plane, the first 20-25 minutes I'd say, and then the rest of the film is set in the actual airport. It's a zombie film for the most part. I wasn't expecting this to be very good because I just heard nobody talking about this film compared to the original anyway, so I thought this was just going to be one of those really bad straight-to-DVD sequels that's just not a patch on the first one, but not the case at all. In fact, I would say that Quarantine 2 is actually better than the first Quarantine film, but there you go. So yeah, I'm glad we managed to get one horror film in anyway, but let's now move on and find out what is today's runner-up. At number 2 then, we have Passenger 57. I just can't stay away from the 90s, can I? This is essentially another Die Hard on a plane clone. We've got Wesley Snipes playing a tough cop, taking on loads of terrorists on a commercial airline, one of which bizarrely is Elizabeth Hurley, but this film is executed very well. In fact, I would say that it's maybe Wesley Snipes' best movie. I mean, he did loads of good ones in the 90s especially. I've never been as big a Blade fan as other people, but Rising Sun was pretty good alongside Sean Connery. I liked Boiling Point a lot as well. Drop Zone was a really good thriller. In fact, I could have included that in this list maybe, given that the characters would have had to have been jumping out of planes all the way through. And Demolition Man, that was pretty good as well, albeit a bit cheesy. So, I mean, Snipes was very prolific in the 90s especially. At some point I'll have to do a Wesley Snipes season and maybe do a rankings at the end of it. But for now, I'm counting Passenger 57 as my second best plane-related movie of all time. But let's now see which is my favourite of all time. Yep, at number 1 I have Die Hard 2, again from the 90s. It's crazy how many of these films today have been from the 90s. So I think it's the case that a lot of Die Hard fans prefer number 3 over number 2, but I'm not one of those. I think this is the second best film in the franchise. There was a time when I was a kid, I'd say between the ages of 11 and 14, where I loved this film so much. I watched it like 7 or 8 times. I even liked it more than the original for quite a long time, actually. I don't know why. I just always seemed to get along very, very well with Die Hard 2. Maybe it's because it was such a violent film. It felt kind of edgy for me at the time to be watching this. I think it is slightly more violent than the original when I think about it. I watched this with my son, though, about 2 weeks ago, and he didn't really like it that much. He liked the first one, but he just found this second one a little bit boring and devoid of good action. That's what he said anyway, and he was taking the piss out of the special effects as well. But kids, what do they know? As far as I'm concerned, Die Hard 2 is a high-quality action film, regardless of whether you're watching it today or 30 years ago, and it is my favourite plane-related film of all time. Do let me know some of yours in the comments below. I am aware of some films that I've not seen that I could well have included today, had I have seen them. I've heard Flight Plan's a pretty good thriller on a plane, Red Eye as well. There's a horror film on Netflix that I didn't quite get around to seeing before I cancelled Netflix, something about demons on a plane or something like that. And also there was a comedy film called Airplane, which I remember watching in the 90s. I'm not usually into comedies, but I had a reasonably good time laughing at that film. It's the one with Leslie Nielsen in, I think. It's really slapstick and there's a laugh every minute. Not something that I would go back to, but yeah, I vaguely remember that one as well. So there we have it. That was my rankings of plane-related movies. I'll be back to do another video very, very soon. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.